All right, good afternoon. Welcome back, Adam Smith fans. This is the fourth and final lecture for this week, the last one before spring break, on Adam Smith, and we're going to be discussing his view on the colonies. This is particularly interesting, I think, as for Americans, because he, I think, sees a lot quicker than most that the policy that the British government was pursuing vis-a-vis their North American colonies it was leading the country to a dead end. And what's fascinating about that is that obviously there's a political angle to this because of, you think about no taxation without representation. But, Smith really gets to the heart of what the problem is that, and it goes back to mercantilism and protectionism, that this desire to create monopoly and for government to pick which companies will prevail and which companies will not prevail is really the source of the problem, and that actually the British government would be much better off actually just trading with the North American colonists, because there were certain fundamental um, features of the free trade system that would have actually benefited both parties, as opposed to this desire to control so much that in their effort to try to monopolize the entirety of the trade, that they're actually losing out on something that would actually, if they just kind of let the American colonies not go, I mean, maintain their allegiance to the crown, but let the colonies trade with Holland, with France, but that most of the trade would still go to Great Britain, and then the expense that would have to be required to send troops over and to enforce customs duties and all these things that all of these laws that Britain had passed, the Navigation Acts, the Sugar Act, the Molasses Act, the Tea Act, all these were monopolistic behaviors that Adam Smith believes is it's stupid economically, and so he obviously lived to see the loss of the colonies, which I'll show you some pictures from the book. They called it killing the goose that lays the golden egg. So that's the game plan for today. Just a bit of a reminder that if I'm talking to you for Wednesday, that the Google Forms lecture for lecture number 2, which was the second lecture on Monday, that dealt with this relationship between town and country, the relationship between agriculture, manufacturing, and foreign commerce, the decline of feudalism, and real estate, the issue of real estate in Europe and America. That is due today. Okay, and then tomorrow, the Google form for lecture number 3, which was Smith's critique of mercantilism and protectionism. This is where you are able to define the invisible hand, one of Smith's most famous economic principles, as well as his very fascinating distinction between money and bullion. So that's due Thursday, and then this lecture, the last of the week, that homework will be due on Friday. Just trying to spread it out for you so that you can have some time to get that done, and then be able to enjoy your spring break. So that's the game plan for today. Homework, the reading for today is 272 to 284 in the Essential Adam Smith, which looks at, what's the book? I'm just curious about that. That is, we're still in book 4, I believe. Let's see here. Yeah, Systems of Political Economy. So we're talking about macroeconomic policy. So when we get back from spring break, that week of the 6th through the 10th, which will still be closed in terms of live classes, we'll have online learning that week. That's Holy Week. So for that week, we'll be finishing up on Adam Smith, and then we'll be done, have Easter, and then we will turn to Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics. Okay, so the questions that you'll need to be pondering as we talk. First, according to Smith, what are the primary causes of colonial prosperity? So that's right out of the gate. We'll talk about that there are certain reasons why colonies actually prosper in a way that the mother country does not. Two, in particular, what are the two primary reasons for the success of the North American colonies? So he actually, by 1776, it had become clear, I think, to most keen economic and political observers that even though in the short term there was a lot more money to be had from the Caribbean, from sugar plantations in particular, and then fermented sugar is well, there's molasses, which is processed pureed sugar, and then fermented molasses is rum, and so that industry was very, very lucrative in the Caribbean, but it also required significant amounts of slave labor, and which actually reduced the profit that would be accruing there. And then, of course, you had slavery in the Southern American colonies, South Carolina, Virginia with tobacco. But again, by 1776, when Smith is writing, the demand for tobacco had leveled off and really petered out. And so the demand for slaves for that activity had also petered out as well. So really, what a lot of people were predicting is that the slow and steady expansion of agricultural produce in the North American colonies, grain, livestock, things of that nature, that was really where and timber for naval shipping, those were these raw materials that would really continue to benefit the British economy, and they wanted to keep it. But then again, there were some politicians that were making some very unwise policies, according to Smith. So anyway, so there's two reasons for the success of the North American colonies, which I think by that time, that was where the action was. What does Smith think of British efforts to prohibit the freedom of these colonists and the entire mercantile system as a whole? So there's a really beautiful passage in this section which talks about liberty. Third question, according to Smith, what are the different negative impacts of the mercantile system of monopoly? So he's equating this mercantilism with the desire for monopoly. And again, these are firms that are rushing to government for help and for assistance. Much in the same way that's happening right now. Think about the airline industry, for example. Fourth, how does Smith describe the growing independence of the American colonists in particular, and the overall discovery of the Americas in general? So there's this great quote, which is right at the beginning of your packet: "The discovery of America and that of the passage to the East Indies by the Cape of Good Hope are the two greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind." Now, you might say, I don't know, the birth of Christ, but for Smith, the hard-headed economist, that's the most important. Okay, and then finally, for Smith, why are the British efforts to monopolize the entirety of American trade doomed to fail? And then how is it related to his final observation on page 284 with that quote, "Consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production." Seems rather obvious, right? So if you are producing something and for the economic marketplace, you want it to be consumed. But Smith is being kind of frustrated because it seems like the economic policymakers of his day, the political economists, were actually getting that essential fact backwards. Okay, so again, I wanted to, before we turn to the reading for today, re-emphasize this beautiful passage on page 265 in the reading from yesterday about the invisible hand, and I think it has a tremendous amount of relevance for what we're doing today in our country. Um, he talks about the fact that people who are pursuing their interests, particularly in foreign trade, don't really look at it as benefiting other people, but that by an invisible hand they are led to promote an end in which they have no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interests, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he intends to promote it. So think about all of these politicians that are intending to promote the public good by some legislative scheme or another to regulate or manage or improve the economic functioning of the macro economy. He says, "I've never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good." That actually, when people trade, they trade for their own private interests. He says it is an affectation indeed not very common among merchants, and very few words need to be employed in dissuading them from it. They're not trading for the public good, they're trading for their private good, but it has public benefit. And then this is, I think, the line that I think if more politicians read it, they'd be better off. It says, "The statesman who should attempt to direct private people in what manner they ought to employ their capitals," meaning there's some things that the government can do to encourage private enterprise, "would not only load himself with the most unnecessary attention, but assume an authority which could safely be trusted not only to no single person, but to no council or senate whatever, and which would nowhere be so dangerous in the hands of a man who had folly and presumption enough to fancy himself fit to exercise it." So by you trying to figure out all of the comings and goings and machinations of the economy, of markets, by you trying to control things as a policymaker, you're just going to make things worse. And a lot of this policymaking that happens today is government like trying to fix problems that they have already created, which there is an irony to that. So anyway, wanted to point your attention to that again. This beauty of the invisible hand. Okay, let's see here. Let's see here. Yeah, we'll leave this. I wanted to show you some. Yeah, we'll talk about this when we get to the North American colonies, but there's some pretty cool shots of some paintings that really depict what Smith is trying to teach. Okay, so let's go to page 272, and here, right out of the gate, we have an answer to one of our questions: the causes of the prosperity of new colonies. And so here, Smith makes clear that there are at least three factors involved. One, that colonists take out knowledge. Oh, hold on for a second. My dog needs to go out. Excuse me. Go ahead. There you go. Sorry about that. So, think about, if you are colonizing, you're going from one place, Europe, that tends to be pretty economically advanced. They have education. They have a system of law and order. They have religion. They have basically civil society. And so you go from there to a place that has less of all of that. And there are certain advantages that colonist is going to bring with him, and a lot of impediments that don't exist because it is relatively unpopulated. It has a tremendous amount of raw natural resources, and it's almost like it's too good to be true. And there's a lot of work that's involved there, but there's some significant benefits. So the one thing he says, the colonists take out knowledge and regular government. So again, civil order. Land is plentiful and cheap. Wages are high because of the factors that we talked about already. And children are taken care of and are profitable. Now, that's not a very romantic notion of children, but back then children once they became of age, were considered to be part of the labor force of a family, particularly in agriculture. Okay, so those those factors, those variables, make it such that the kind of benefits of civilization that Europe has taken a long time to develop are brought over, and they're actually able to kind of almost have free reign, so to speak. Now, again, I'm putting off to the side the whole debate about whether it was just or not for Europe to colonize the Americas in the first place. Clearly, there were massive violations of natural justice that took place there. But from an economic standpoint, purely economic, Smith would say that one of the differences obviously is that land is cheap and wages are high and family life is promoted in a way that's harder to do in Britain because most of the land has been bought up, wages have been depressed for a while, and it's a real question about whether family life is being promoted, especially if wages are kept artificially low. Okay. Um, Says that in other countries, and again, this is on page 273, first full paragraph. These are the established countries, not the colonial countries. Rent and profit eat up wages. Remember, that was one of the, when you move from a very primitive society where all the produce of labor was controlled by the laborer, once you introduce private property, then you got a situation where rent is going to actually take some of that wage and take it from the laborer. And so, not in the colonies though, because there's always more plentiful labor to be had. And the two superior orders of people oppress the inferior one. But in new colonies, the interest of the two superior orders obliges them to treat the inferior one with more generosity and humanity. Now, he does make a distinction, if not for slavery. Now, slavery is reintroducing that kind of oppression that Smith would be very much against. So Smith was a leader in the cause for actually opposing slavery. Now, he did it particularly from an economic perspective, but he did not feel that slave labor was the most productive and the most efficient way of producing goods and services. Now, I love this quote on page 274, and I think this has a lot to do with why things are working out so well among the North American colonies. Plenty of good land and liberty to manage their own affairs. So, cheap land, liberty, basically self government, seems to be the two great causes of the prosperity of all new colonies. So, think about that. When Great Britain starts to regulate after the French and Indian War, the North American colonies, there is this kind of hue and cry and just massive opposition because they were used to managing their own affairs, and now they were being told that there were certain things they could not do. Now, still, there was plenty of good land, but what was another thing that the British government imposed in 1763? The proclamation line, which basically made it illegal for American colonists to travel across the Appalachian Mountains and settle in the Ohio and Tennessee valleys. And if you remember Smith's argument about if land is cheap and wages are high, what happens to population? It increases, right? People have children and they stay alive. And so if you got more children, what are you going to need? You're going to need more land. Well, Great Britain, because of this regulation, is preventing this new land from being exploited. And that was actually even more of a problem than a increase of the tax on tea and paper and stamps and things of that nature. Okay. So it says to prohibit a great people, however, from making all that they can of every part of their own produce, basically preventing economic freedom, or from employing their stock and industry in the way that they judge most advantageous to themselves. So having laws that prevent people from exercising economic freedom is a what? A manifest violation of the most sacred rights of mankind. So there I think he's really riffing off of Locke, right? That we have these fundamental inalienable rights, life, liberty, and and property. And so if you do have those things, let people manage their own affairs. And still land is cheap, and consequently labor so dear among them that they could import from the mother country almost all the more refined or more advanced manufactures cheaper than they could make for themselves. Okay, so their labor was so scarce that there was actually, I mean, the price of it was so expensive that it was still economically profitable for the colonies not to have manufacturing, but to just import everything from Great Britain and continue just to live off the proceeds of rent and land. And that really, when you think about it, that ends up becoming an essential debate once we declare our independence and become an independent nation about what should be the proper balance in the American economy between agriculture and manufacturing. Remember, it's agriculture, manufacturing, foreign trade. Well, did not have manufacturing because Great Britain not only prevented it from occurring, but as Smith just said, it really wasn't profitable to have a lot of manufacturing. But if you're an independent nation, one thing you better be able to manufacture pretty quickly is armaments for national defense, which is a legitimate governmental function, according to Smith. So that becomes much more of an issue when we declare independence. But back then, who was providing national defense? Well, it was Great Britain. Okay. All right, so on bottom of 275, he shifts gears and he talks about, he really returns to this issue of monopoly, which he had begun in the section that we read yesterday, but he just continues it. And so he's really critical of this desire on the part of the British government to monopolize colonial trade. And so in that little inset in the bottom of 275, it says, a monopoly of the colony trade makes industry and commerce less secure owing to its being driven into one channel. So this kind of allure of trying to control the entirety of colonial trade is actually going to make industry, meaning manufacturing, and also just work ethic, and commerce, trading back and forth, less secure. Okay, because you're just going to kind of put your eggs in one basket, and let's say the bottom falls out of a particular market, let's say tea, or for example, then you're going to be out of luck. Okay. And so again, for us, it's very fascinating as Americans because he's commenting upon, from a British perspective, he's criticizing British policy vis-a-vis North America. First full paragraph, he says the expectation of a rupture with the colonies, and so if this was published in 1776, and this is a 5-volume set, we're talking about, he must have been writing this in 1773, 1774, all that period of time when all those, the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party and the Intolerable Acts were going on. So it really was kind of the buzz of the elites about what should be done with North America. It says the expectation of a rupture with the colonies accordingly has struck the people of Great Britain with more terror than they ever felt for a Spanish Armada or a French invasion. So this is more disruptive than a military invasion. Why? Because there's so much economic activity that's taking place between the mother country and North America, and because of some foolish mercantilistic policies, there's a possibility that Britain is going to, as this picture I'm going to show you in a second would make clear, they're going to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. And I get the sense when after reading Smith, and I read him in college and quoted him a lot in my work, but it's been a real pleasure actually to go back and really reread him. He's a very kind of calm, sedate, serene kind of guy. And he's not somebody who is prone to hyperbole. But in this section, you can tell he's angry. He's upset that these stupid politicians are going to actually mess up a great relationship. Okay, so he says that he talks about the Stamp Act. It was the terror, whether well or grounded, which rendered the repeal of the Stamp Act among the merchants at least a popular measure. So and Parliament kept on and said, well, we'll take off the Stamp Act, but we still can tax you. We'll take off the Townsend duties, but we'll keep it on with tea. And so this declaratory act, it's almost like a parent saying, well, you can go out and play, kids, but I'm still in charge. And that's kind of how it was how Britain was dealing with America as a parent would deal with a petulant child. This is how great would be the disorder and confusion, which must necessarily be occasioned by a sudden and entire stop in the employment of so great a proportion of our principal manufacturers. So, are you really going to ruin this home market for all of our manufactured goods? So, what's his solution? His solution at the bottom of 276 is to relax some of these laws that gave Great Britain the exclusive trade to the colonies. So, Sugar Act, Molasses Act, Navigation Act, Tea Act. So relax them, reduce the rate, show the colonies that you understand that having them in the British system is better than having them not within it. Till it be rendered in a great measure free seems to be the only expedient which can in all future times deliver her from this danger, which can enable her or even force her to withdraw some part of her capital from this overgrown employment and to turn it, though with less profit, towards other employments, and which by gradually diminishing one branch of her industry and gradually increasing all the rest can by degrees restore all the different branches of it to the natural, healthful, and proper proportion which perfect liberty necessarily establishes and which perfect liberty can alone preserve. So what's his solution is liberty. It's free trade. And it's let people decide to trade with whoever they want to trade with. And yeah, you might lose out to a little bit to some cheaper products from the Dutch West Indies or the French Caribbean, but let the market work its will. Usually that would mean that maybe other competitors would lower their prices, and then maybe you get back that trade with the colonies. He says to open up the colony trade all at once to all nations might not only occasion some inconvenience, but a great permanent loss to the greater part of those industry. So what he's saying is that do it gradually. Be smart about this thing, And the worst thing that could happen is actually declare war on the very people that are enriching the rest of your society. And here, he doesn't use the exclamation point very often, but he does in this instance. He says, such are the unfortunate, this is on 277, such are the unfortunate effects of all the regulations of the mercantile system. All of them. They not only introduce very dangerous disorders into the state of the body politic. What does disorders mean? Basically revolution. So 1776, you've had the Continental Congress meet, and maybe there's buzz about a declaration of independence. But disorders which is often difficult to remedy without occasioning, for a time at least, still greater disorders. So what do they end up having to do to stop them from declaring independence? Send troops over and fight a very expensive, costly war, which actually reduces the economic activity within the North American colonies. So therefore, they are not producing the raw materials. You can't ship over finished goods because we're basically boycotting your goods, and the whole thing kind of goes up in smoke. Why? Because there are a few politicians in cahoots with a few corporate leaders like the British East India Company that can't stand that they don't control everything. And therefore, they're going to ruin it for everybody else. That's, I think, Smith's major point. And so he talks about at the bottom of 277 this problem with monopoly. It hinders the capital of that country. It reduces wages, it raises profits, and thereby tends to lower rents and the price of land. Not in America, in England, Great Britain. Okay. All right. And so he continues this theme on 278, talking about other results of monopoly. If there's one thing that you should understand, Smith hates monopoly. He hates tariffs, unless they're being used to retaliate against other tariffs that are worse from other countries. He says monopoly reduces the absolute amount of profit, thus rendering all the original source of revenue less abundant. More fatal still, it destroys parsimony, basically good relations, friendships. He says all, bottom of 278, all the original sources of revenue, the wages of labor, the rent of land, the profits of stock, all those things that are related to wages, the monopoly renders much less abundant than they would otherwise be. So when you are starting to try to control trade, you are controlling and reducing the things that will promote high wages of labor. And remember, how do you get wages to rise? Because remember, he says that most masters don't want to pay. They only want to pay the minimum amount that is necessary, because they've got other people who are competing with them in their same economic sector, and so this desire to lower wages is always there. But Smith says, look, higher wages is what you want because it promotes family life, it promotes growth. Well, how do you do it? You have to increase national wealth. Well, how do you increase national wealth? By restricting trade and trying to provide monopoly? No. Free trade, again, it's counterintuitive. It's people promoting their own self-interest, but that invisible hand is going to make it so that actually you're going to create more wealth than you would have had if you were just kind of coming up with some scheme or concoction on your own. And again, I can't stress enough how relevant this is today, when a lot of people in Washington think they can just snap their fingers and change the way the economy functions. Okay. All right. Let's see here. He mentions on page 280 this basically this conflict between the American colonies and the Parliament of Great Britain. He says the Parliament of Great Britain insists upon taxing the colonies, and they refuse to be taxed by a parliament in which they are not represented. What is that? No taxation without representation. If to each colony, which should detach itself from the General Confederacy, Great Britain should allow such a number of representatives as suited the proportion of what it contributed to the public revenue of the empire, in consequence of its being subjected to the same taxes, and in compensation admitted to the same freedom of trade with its fellow subjects at home, the number of its representatives to be augmented as the proportion of its contribution might afterwards augment, a new method of acquiring importance, a new more dazzling object of ambition would be presented to the leading men of each colony. In other words, hey, if they're, what Smith is saying is that why don't you call their bluff? If they want representation, give it to them. They actually probably would prefer it. Now, what's the dirty little secret there? Are they ever going to be in a position to be a majority in the British Parliament? Highly unlikely. This was Benjamin Franklin's argument. That, hey, look, if you want this representation thing, I'm not sure we want it, because we're always going to get outvoted, and then they can at least say, well, at least you had representation. All right. So Smith is kind of saying, look, if they are really wanting it, give it to them. Don't fight it. So he says that what you're doing now, though, by preventing them from having this natural outlet of ambition, is that you are creating a scenario and a set of circumstances where, instead of just being, think about old George Washington, right? We're right there, right? He's a planter in some field in Virginia. If you asked a man on the street of Great Britain where that was, he might not know. Okay, so he probably would have toiled in anonymity. He would have just been a guy and nobody knew in history. Welcome to most human experience. But because you're preventing him from trading the way he wants to trade, you are now going to basically force him into pursuing a political career. And so that's going to provide an avenue for his ambition as well. And so what's going to be the result? You're basically creating political competition by this stupid economic policy that you're pursuing. Okay. He says at the bottom of 280, he's saying it's not very probable they will ever voluntarily submit to us, and we ought to consider that the blood which must be shed in forcing them to do so is every drop of it the blood either of those who are or of those whom we wish to have for our fellow citizens. He says, from shopkeepers, tradesmen, and attorneys, they are becoming what? Statesmen and legislators. And they actually have the effrontery to think that they're actually going to be starting a country, an extensive empire, he says, that are actually going to be more powerful than you are. Now, is Adam Smith predicting the future? You bet he is. In fact, I think in other writings it's suggested, in Smith's writings, that he would say, look, maybe we're going to get to the point, if we keep the North American colonies attached to us by just not trying to control things, but just trading with them. It might be because of natural population growth that the capital of Great Britain moves from London to North America. But he would say, what's the big deal? You've got a transatlantic empire that would benefit both sides. Why wouldn't you want something like that? Well, maybe it's because there are, again, some of these politicians that don't want to share. It's like, in kindergarten, the kid who doesn't want to share his toys. That's a lot of what's going on here with the British Parliament. Okay. Hopefully you're getting this idea of this real, almost hostility that Adam Smith has toward monopoly and preventing liberty, essentially, in both the political and economic realms. Okay. He says on the top of 282 that this desire to monopolize the colonial trade of the Americas, he likens it to kind of a dazzling object. It's like a shiny toy that everybody wants, and it's almost like you can't resist trying to control it. He says, at first sight, no doubt, the monopoly of the great commerce of America naturally seems to be an acquisition of the highest value. Like, why wouldn't you want it, right? To the undiscernible eye of giddy ambition, it naturally presents itself amidst the confused scramble of politics and wars. Like, it's worth all of it. It's worth fighting for. It's worth, compromising over. A dazzling object to fight for. The dazzling, he says it again, the dazzling splendor of the object, however, the immense greatness of the commerce is the very quality which renders the monopoly of it hurtful. So the fact that it's so extensive, so vast, so potentially enriching, that attempt to try to monopolize it is a fool's errand. And what's the harder you squeeze, what? It's going to go through your fingers. Open it up a little bit, let it come back and forth. What if you love something, let it go free? That's kind of what he is suggesting. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let's see here. Yeah, we're almost done. So he says in the bottom of 283. It is thus that the private interests and passions of individuals naturally dispose them to turn their stock towards the employments which in ordinary cases are most advantageous to the society. So he says basically trust the Americans. Yes, they might trade with some of our global competitors, the Dutch and the French in particular, and that might in some respects be disadvantageous to the realm. But it's going to keep them in the network, and eventually things are going to equilibrium is going to be established, and there's going to be comparative advantage. And yes, there's going to be some instances where it does make more sense for the colonies to trade with maybe the Dutch West Indies because it's a little bit easier trip. But then there are all these, there's not going to be manufacturing in the Dutch West Indies. This is purely raw material. And really what he's talking about is the rum and molasses industry and the sugar industry. That you might have to give in a little bit on that, but you're going to gain so much more in the increase in consumer demand for your finished products that you're making in Great Britain. And so again, don't ruin things just because you want to try to control things. And so we get to the final page on page 284 where Smith is trying to remind his fellow statesmen and his fellow elites that if you're in an economic endeavor, the whole idea is to produce things to be consumed. You want to sell them. He says consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production. Production is not the opposite. He says this maxim is so perfectly self-evident that it would be absurd to attempt to prove it. It's like, duh. But, he says, the mercantile system, the political system, these politicians, the interest of the consumer is almost constantly sacrificed to that of the producer. So it's just backwards. And so instead of having consumer sovereignty, and you can see that a free market economy is very similar to an elective system or a system of a republic. Because how does it work? In a republic, we vote for our elected officials. In a free market, we vote for the products we choose to purchase. And so we have this freedom to choose, right? Milton Friedman's famous book, Freedom to Choose. We can choose our leaders and we can choose our products. So who is it? Whether you're a voter or a consumer, you have what? Sovereignty. We the people. We the consumer. And so Smith is saying that's the system, not this system of control, not this system of monopoly. And again, I think it actually, we should send this book to every member of Congress and every state legislator and have them read it. I think you might actually get some better laws. Okay? Just to conclude, he's got some interest. This is, again, a beautiful book that my parents got for me. It says here, the English colonies in North America outstrip all others in prosperity. Remember talking about why colonies are prosperous? Because why? The colonists have what? Plenty of good land, liberty to manage their own affairs, and freedom from bearing the costs of their own defense. The rolling acres of a manicured farm in Massachusetts, the old State House in Boston, the seat of the first elected legislatures in the Americas, and then there is a picture of ordinary men with nothing more than talent and industry and the vitality of colonial families. So there's his name is Elijah Boardman. He was a tradesman who became a congressman, and then the long-lived members of the Savage family of Massachusetts. So here is just, in picture form what Smith is talking about, right? And, you're going to have some Americans getting rich off of that, but what's the matter with that, right? Let 1,000 blossoms bloom. And then this last one, let me show you this real quick. This one, I think. This is a cartoon from a 1770 satirizing Britain's determination to harm the colonial goose that lays the golden eggs, a view shared by Smith. It is folly, he argues, to resist American demands for more autonomy and free trade. British consumers are paying to protect and restrain a country of shopkeepers and producers who would readily sell their goods to Britain without the ties of colonialism. So this is this great picture here. Again, this is from the newspapers talking about, again, killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. All right, so that's the end, I guess, at least before spring break, of Adam Smith. We'll have one more week of him when we get back. Get those Google Forms finished. You've got till Friday to do that, and then enjoy the rest of your spring break. And we'll be back in action again. My prayers to you and your family during this period of time. Hopefully, you can kind of take a little bit of a break and really realize what is most important, right? Faith, family, and friends, and if Adam Smith's right, freedom. All right, thank you very much. God bless you all, and we'll see you in about 2 weeks. Thanks.